Billionaire saw a single mom get evicted on TV. He recognized the address. It was one of his. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Before we begin today's emotional story, please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city and state, or your country if you're joining us from somewhere else. Today's story follows a struggling single mother, her young son, and an old brass key that once opened the door to their home. When a powerful billionaire discovers that a decision made by his own company has forced them onto the streets, he is confronted with a painful question. How many lives can be destroyed when people become nothing more than numbers on a screen? This is a story about dignity, responsibility, compassion, and the courage to make things right. Now, let's begin. Sometimes the smallest object in your hand carries the heaviest weight on your heart. The old brass key slipped from Naomi Carter's trembling fingers and struck the concrete steps with a sharp metallic clink that somehow sounded louder than the television cameras surrounding her. It bounced once, then twice, before coming to rest beside a faded chalk drawing of a smiling sun that her 5-year-old son, Eli, had sketched on the sidewalk only 3 days earlier. The afternoon sky above Cleveland hung low with thick gray clouds, wrapping the apartment complex in a cold October light that made everything seem smaller than it really was. Naomi stood frozen on the front steps, one hand gripping the handle of a worn duffel bag, while the other instinctively reached for Eli's tiny shoulder. The little boy looked up at her with quiet confusion, clutching his stuffed dinosaur beneath one arm. He wasn't crying. Somehow, that made everything hurt even more. Around them, several neighbors watched from behind cracked curtains, while others stood silently on nearby balconies, unsure whether to offer comfort or pretend not to notice. A television reporter adjusted her microphone only a few feet away. The cameraman slowly zoomed in, careful not to miss the exhausted young mother whose entire life now sat inside for mismatched plastic storage bins lined along the curb. Naomi bent down, picked up the old key, and closed her fingers around it so tightly that the edges pressed into her palm. She had unlocked apartment 3B with that same key every evening for nearly 4 years. She had carried groceries through that doorway after 12-hour shifts. She had measured Eli's height against the kitchen wall inside that apartment every birthday. She had whispered bedtime stories there after working double shifts cleaning classrooms before sunrise and caring for elderly patients until nearly midnight. Home had never been luxurious. The plumbing rattled whenever the upstairs neighbors showered. The windows let cold air seep inside every winter. The refrigerator hummed loudly enough to wake light sleepers. But it had been theirs. At least, that was what Naomi had believed until this morning. "Ms. Carter," the reporter asked gently, lowering her voice, "would you like to say anything about what happened today?" Naomi looked toward the camera only briefly before lowering her eyes again. Her voice came quietly, almost carried away by the wind. "Just, please don't make my son remember today, because strangers wanted a story." The reporter hesitated. Even the cameraman lowered his lens for a moment. Eli tugged softly on Naomi's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "are we going somewhere else now?" Naomi forced a smile that almost held together. "Yes, sweetheart. Just for a little while." Across the country, nearly 600 miles away, Marcus Ellington barely noticed the large conference room overlooking downtown Chicago anymore. At 39, the founder and CEO of Ellington Property Group had spent so many years inside polished glass towers that city skylines blurred together. Around him, executives discussed quarterly projections, acquisition targets, and occupancy rates displayed across a wall-sized monitor. Numbers filled every slide. Percentages, growth curves, market forecasts. Someone muted the financial presentation as the television mounted near the conference room switched automatically to breaking local news coverage from Ohio. No one intended to watch. It simply appeared while technicians updated another display. Marcus glanced toward the screen without thinking. The reporter stood beside a young black mother holding her son outside a modest brick apartment building. Then the camera widened. His eyes drifted past the woman, past the eviction notice taped beside the entrance, past the overflowing storage bins. They stopped on the address mounted above the front door. 1847, Ashbury Lane, Building 7. His heartbeat slowed before it suddenly seemed to disappear altogether. Every conversation inside the boardroom faded beneath an unbearable silence only he could hear. He knew that address, not because he had ever visited it, because he had personally approved the acquisition package containing that exact property less than 3 years ago. Marcus slowly reached for the television remote and raised the volume. One of his vice presidents continued explaining revenue projections until he noticed Marcus wasn't listening. Marcus? Nobody answered. The CEO stared at the screen as Naomi gently lifted one heavy storage bin while Eli struggled to drag a tiny blue backpack across the cracked sidewalk. Then the old brass key slipped from her hand again. It landed on the concrete with the same lonely sound. Marcus leaned forward, unable to look away. His voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. Who approved that eviction? The city looked different after sunset when you no longer had a place to return to. Streetlights stretched long reflections across damp pavement as Naomi guided Eli through downtown Cleveland with one hand wrapped around his little fingers and the other pulling a suitcase whose wheels clicked unevenly over cracked sidewalks. The evening air carried the scent of rain mixed with fresh bread drifting from a bakery that was already closing for the night. Cars rolled past without slowing. People hurried home with grocery bags, takeout dinners, and conversations waiting behind familiar front doors. Naomi kept walking because standing still made the truth feel heavier. She checked the balance on her phone one more time beneath the glow of a bus stop advertisement. After paying for gas, diapers earlier that week, and the portion of rent she had believed would keep them inside apartment 3B, she had less than $80 left. Enough for food if she was careful. Not enough for a hotel that could last more than one night. Eli looked up at her. Mom, are we still going to school tomorrow? Naomi brushed a loose curl away from his forehead and smiled with a gentleness she did not feel. You are. We are going to make sure of that. He nodded as though that answer solved everything. Children had a remarkable way of believing promises before they understood how expensive they could become. 20 minutes later, they reached a small church that operated an overnight family shelter. A handwritten sign taped to the entrance apologized that every bed had already been assigned. A volunteer stepped outside wearing a thick navy sweater and offered Naomi 2 paper cups filled with hot vegetable soup and a small paper bag containing crackers, apples, and peanut butter. Naomi thanked her with quiet dignity. She did not ask whether someone else might cancel. She knew too many families probably hoped for the same thing tonight. They sat together on a wooden bench across the street beneath the shelter's porch light. Steam drifted from the soup into the chilly evening, while Eli carefully dipped each cracker before eating it. Halfway through his meal, he noticed an elderly man standing near the sidewalk searching through an overloaded shopping cart. Without saying anything, Eli held out his untouched apple. The man smiled with surprised gratitude before accepting it. Naomi watched silently. She had spent years trying to teach kindness. Somehow, tonight, her son reminded her that kindness often survived even when comfort disappeared. When the soup was gone, Naomi unfolded a city map she had picked up inside the church. One community center allowed families to remain indoors until morning. It was nearly 1 mile away. She adjusted the straps on the duffel bag resting against her shoulder. Ready for one more walk? She asked softly. Eli reached for her hand again. As long as we stay together. She squeezed his fingers before they continued beneath rows of amber streetlights. Nearly 600 miles away, Marcus Ellington had canceled the remainder of the executive meeting without explanation. His board members exchanged puzzled looks while financial reports remained frozen across enormous digital screens. Inside his private office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Chicago's glowing skyline, but Marcus never turned toward the view. Instead, he replayed the news segment over and over on his laptop. Every pause revealed another detail he had missed before. The frightened child gripping a blue backpack, the weathered apartment entrance, the key falling onto the concrete, the exhaustion hidden behind Naomi's steady voice. He opened the internal property database and entered the address. Building 7 appeared instantly. Occupancy reports, maintenance records, revenue summaries. Then another file caught his attention. Rent adjustment notices. One increase. Then another. Then another. Each one had been approved automatically through a pricing optimization program implemented company-wide. He remembered signing the initiative after consultants presented colorful charts promising stronger returns and greater efficiency. Back then it had been nothing more than numbers moving upward across a screen. Tonight, every percentage suddenly carried a face. Marcus scrolled through dozens of tenant complaints filed over the previous 6 months. Most had never reached his office. They had been filtered through departments, regional managers, automated responses, and legal reviews until they became statistics instead of people. His assistant knocked gently before stepping inside. "Your flight to New York leaves at 7 tomorrow morning," she reminded him. Marcus never looked up from the screen. "Cancel it." She hesitated. "You have meetings scheduled for weeks." Marcus finally raised his eyes. They carried none of the calm certainty his employees were used to seeing. "Book me the first flight to Cleveland instead." His assistant blinked with quiet surprise. "Is everything all right?" Marcus glanced once more at the frozen image of Naomi standing beside her son beneath the gray October sky. The old brass key rested inside her closed hand, as though she still refused to let go of something the world had already taken away. "No," he answered quietly. "I think something has been wrong for a very long time, and I am only seeing it now." Morning arrived quietly, wrapped in pale autumn light that slipped through the tall windows of the community center where dozens of families had spent the night on folding cots. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee, laundry detergent, and the waffles volunteers were preparing in the small kitchen down the hall. Naomi opened her eyes before the first alarm sounded. Years of early shifts had trained her body to wake before sunrise no matter how exhausted she felt. She sat up carefully, making sure not to disturb Eli, whose tiny hand still rested on the sleeve of her sweater, as though even in sleep he wanted to make certain she had not disappeared. She looked around the crowded room. Children still slept beneath donated blankets while parents quietly packed backpacks, folded clothing, and prepared themselves for another day that demanded strength before breakfast. Naomi reached into her duffel bag and removed a small comb, smoothing Eli's curls with gentle patience after he woke. She wiped his face with a warm cloth offered by one of the volunteers and buttoned his clean blue jacket. "You look handsome," she whispered. Eli smiled proudly. "Can we still stop by Mrs. Harper's house after school?" Naomi paused only for a heartbeat before answering. Mrs. Harper was the elderly widow Naomi had cared for every evening after finishing her cleaning job at Lincoln Elementary School. "If she still needs us," Naomi replied softly, "then yes. We always keep our promises." They shared breakfast with the other families before walking toward the elementary school. Along the way, they passed familiar storefronts preparing to open for business. Delivery trucks unloaded fresh produce. A florist arranged bright orange chrysanthemums outside her shop. Somewhere nearby, a church bell echoed across the cool morning air. Life continued with comforting normality, even while Naomi quietly carried the uncertainty of not knowing where they would sleep that night. After dropping Eli off with a hug that lingered a little longer than usual, she headed toward Mrs. Harper's small white house on Maple Street. The elderly woman answered the door wearing a thick cardigan and looked surprised to see Naomi arrive carrying nothing but her work bag. "Child," Mrs. Harper said gently, "I saw the news last night." Naomi lowered her eyes with a modest smile. "I am all right." Mrs. Harper reached for her hand. "That is not the same thing." Naomi only nodded before stepping inside. They spent the next 2 hours preparing breakfast, organizing medication, watering houseplants, and folding freshly dried towels. Mrs. Harper moved slowly because arthritis made simple chores painful, but Naomi never rushed her. She listened patiently to stories she had already heard many times before. She laughed at familiar jokes as though they were brand new. When she finished, Mrs. Harper quietly placed an envelope on the kitchen table. Naomi glanced at it without touching it. "You worked extra hours yesterday," the older woman explained. "Please take it." Naomi gently pushed the envelope back across the table. "You already pay me fairly. I cannot accept more because I had a difficult day." Before Mrs. Harper could respond, a loud knock sounded outside. Naomi opened the front door and found another elderly tenant from the same apartment complex standing on the porch with 2 grocery bags balanced awkwardly against her walker. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks looked overwhelmed. "I heard they changed the locks this morning," she whispered. "They told me I have until tomorrow. I do not know where to begin." Without hesitation, Naomi stepped forward, lifted both heavy bags, and smiled with quiet reassurance. "Then let us begin together." They spent the next several hours carefully packing family photographs, dishes wrapped in old newspapers, faded quilts stitched decades earlier, and a collection of handwritten recipe cards tied together with blue ribbon. Naomi treated every object as though it carried someone's memories instead of simply taking up space inside cardboard boxes. Mrs. Brooks stopped several times to wipe away tears, but Naomi never asked her to hurry. "Your memories deserve better than rushing," she said gently. Across town, inside a rental car parked beneath colorful autumn trees, Marcus watched from a respectful distance after following the address listed in Mrs. Harper's caregiver records. He had expected anger. He had expected someone asking for sympathy. Instead, he watched a woman with no permanent place to sleep spend her entire morning protecting someone else's dignity before her own. Resting on the passenger seat beside him lay a printed folder filled with reports, spreadsheets, and financial summaries that suddenly seemed impossibly small compared to the quiet strength unfolding only a few yards away. For the first time in many years, Marcus understood that character was revealed most clearly not by what people possessed, but by what they still chose to give away after almost everything had been taken from them. The drive back to downtown Cleveland felt longer than it should have. Rain gathered in small beads across the windshield, softening the city into blurred lights and quiet shadows, while Marcus Ellington kept both hands on the steering wheel without turning on the radio. Silence had become easier to listen to than explanations. Every few blocks, he caught himself replaying the morning inside his mind. Naomi lifting heavy boxes that did not belong to her. Eli smiling at strangers despite sleeping in a shelter the night before. Mrs. Brooks carefully wrapping old family photographs, while Naomi waited without a trace of impatience. None of it matched the language inside the reports stacked on the passenger seat beside him. The reports described occupancy rates, operational efficiency, and revenue optimization. They never mentioned memories packed inside cardboard boxes. They never mentioned children asking whether they would still go to school tomorrow. Marcus parked outside the regional management office responsible for the apartment complex and entered without announcing who he was. Employees hurried across polished tile floors carrying folders and coffee cups, surprised to see the company's chief executive standing quietly in the lobby. Within minutes, he was seated inside the conference room with the regional director, the property manager, and 2 compliance supervisors. A spreadsheet filled the large monitor. Colored charts climbed steadily upward. Building 7 exceeded projected revenue by 18% this fiscal year, the regional director said proudly. Marcus studied the numbers without speaking. What caused the increase? The room fell briefly silent before the property manager answered. Dynamic pricing adjustments. Higher renewal rates. Reduced vacancy losses. Marcus looked up. How many tenants received multiple rent increases within 12 months? Fingers tapped nervously across laptop keyboards. Approximately 143, someone finally admitted. How many filed hardship requests? Another pause. 62. Marcus waited. How many were personally reviewed by a human being before final decisions were made? No one answered immediately. The property manager shifted uneasily in his chair. Most requests were processed through the automated evaluation system approved 3 years ago. Marcus lowered his eyes toward the folder in front of him. 3 years ago. He remembered the presentation almost perfectly. Consultants had promised consistency, fairness, and improved financial performance. He had signed the proposal before catching a flight to another investor meeting. It had seemed responsible, efficient, modern. He had never asked what happened after someone clicked the approval button. He had never imagined that an algorithm could quietly become a wall between people and compassion. His gaze settled on the signature printed at the bottom of the original authorization document. His own name stood there in dark blue ink. For several long seconds, no one inside the room spoke. Outside the conference room windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. Marcus suddenly remembered another rainy afternoon more than 25 years earlier. He had been 11 years old, standing beside his mother while she folded clothes into black trash bags because they had lost the apartment where he had spent his childhood. He remembered pretending to be brave so his younger sister would not cry. He remembered promising himself that one day he would build enough success that no family he was responsible for would ever feel invisible. Somewhere between board meetings, quarterly reports, and expanding across dozens of cities, that promise had quietly disappeared beneath spreadsheets. The memory settled heavily across his shoulders. He closed the folder without another glance at the financial charts. Effective immediately, he said calmly. I want every pending eviction inside this region reviewed by actual people, not software. The regional director hesitated. That will delay operations. Marcus met his eyes. Then operations will wait. It will affect earnings. Then earnings will change. Corporate policy requires approval from the executive committee. Marcus stood slowly, gathering the folder beneath one arm. I am corporate policy. The room remained silent as he walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he stopped without turning around. Tomorrow morning, I want the complete history behind every rent increase in Building 7 on my desk. Not summaries, not percentages. I want names, conversations, and every request for help that never reached this office. He stepped into the hallway where the sounds of ringing telephones and printers suddenly felt strangely distant. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Thin sunlight broke through the gray clouds, reflecting across puddles scattered along the sidewalk. Marcus looked toward the clearing sky and realized that repairing a mistake was never as simple as admitting it existed. Some debts were measured in dollars. Others were measured in trust. He knew which one would be far more difficult to repay. The following afternoon arrived with clear blue skies that almost felt unfair after everything the previous day had carried. Cool autumn air drifted through the streets as golden leaves tumbled across the sidewalks outside Lincoln Elementary School. Naomi stood near the front entrance waiting for Eli to finish class, her worn canvas bag resting against one shoulder while the old brass key remained tucked safely inside her coat pocket. She had thought about throwing it away more than once. It no longer opened a door. Yet every time her fingers touched its smooth edges, she remembered the small life she and Eli had built one ordinary evening at a time. When the final bell rang, children poured outside in waves of laughter and backpacks. Eli spotted his mother immediately and sprinted toward her with the kind of smile that ignored every hardship adults carried. He wrapped both arms around her waist. "Guess what?" he said excitedly. "I got every spelling word right." Naomi crouched until they were eye level and kissed his forehead. "I knew you would." They started walking toward the community center together, passing rows of maple trees glowing with shades of amber and red. Neither of them noticed the dark gray sedan parked half a block away. Marcus remained inside for several seconds before stepping onto the sidewalk. He had changed into a simple navy jacket and jeans that drew little attention. No security team followed him. No assistants carried schedules behind him. He wanted this conversation to belong to two people rather than a title. As Naomi paused outside a neighborhood grocery store to let Eli admire a display of carved pumpkins, Marcus approached slowly, careful not to interrupt. "Excuse me," he said politely. Naomi turned, instinctively placing a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder. Marcus offered a respectful smile. "I hope I am not disturbing you. My name is Marcus." He did not offer his last name. Naomi studied him for a quiet moment before nodding. "Can I help you?" Marcus hesitated, choosing honesty without revealing everything. "I saw what happened to you on the news. I have been trying to understand how something like that could happen." Naomi looked away briefly toward the busy street, where traffic flowed with ordinary purpose. "A lot of people watched," she answered softly. "Most of them probably forgot by dinner." "I did not," Marcus replied. The sincerity in his voice surprised even him. They continued walking together at an easy pace while Eli wandered a few steps ahead, stopping every few feet to kick colorful leaves into the air. Marcus noticed that Naomi never let the distance between them grow too large. Even in conversation, her attention remained centered on her son. "Were you able to find somewhere to stay?" he asked gently. "For now," Naomi answered. "Tomorrow will figure itself out when tomorrow arrives." Marcus frowned almost imperceptibly. "That sounds like a difficult way to live." Naomi smiled with quiet grace. "It is. But worrying about tomorrow has never fed my son today." They reached a small park where wooden benches overlooked a playground filled with laughing children. Eli asked permission to play for a few minutes. Naomi agreed after making him promise to stay where she could see him. As the little boy hurried toward the swings, silence settled comfortably between the two adults. Marcus watched Eli climb carefully onto a swing without asking another child to move. "He seems like a remarkable young man," Marcus said. Naomi's eyes followed her son with unmistakable warmth. "He teaches me more than I teach him." After another long pause, Marcus finally asked the question that had followed him across 2 states. "If you could say one thing to the people responsible for what happened, What would it be? Naomi reached into her coat pocket and slowly removed the old brass key. Afternoon sunlight reflected softly across its worn surface. She held it in the palm of her hand for several seconds before extending it toward Marcus. Confused, he accepted it. The metal felt unexpectedly warm. Naomi looked at the key instead of at him. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. I do not need anyone to unlock another door for me. She lifted her eyes to meet his for the first time without hesitation. I just want someone to tell me why they decided to lock the one I already had. Marcus stared silently at the small piece of brass resting in his hand. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow it felt heavier than every contract he had ever signed. For the first time since arriving in Cleveland, he understood that the answer she deserved could never be found inside a financial report. It had to begin with someone willing to admit that a mistake had been made, and that someone was standing only a few feet away. Marcus remained on the park bench long after Naomi and Eli walked toward the community center, the old brass key resting quietly in his palm. Children laughed nearby as swings creaked gently beneath the cool afternoon breeze, but every sound seemed strangely distant. He turned the key over once, tracing the worn grooves with his thumb. Years of use had polished the metal smooth. It was not simply a key. It was proof that someone had believed she belonged somewhere until a decision made inside an office erased that certainty. Marcus slipped the key carefully into his jacket pocket before returning to his rental car. The drive to the regional headquarters took less than 20 minutes, but by the time he stepped into the executive conference room, every member of the regional leadership team had already been called back for an emergency meeting. Thick folders covered the polished table. Legal counsel joined through a large video screen from Chicago. 2 members of the executive committee appeared from New York. No one expected the conversation that followed. Marcus stood near the windows instead of taking his usual seat at the head of the table. Evening sunlight stretched across the conference room floor, painting long golden rectangles between rows of expensive leather chairs. I have reviewed every report you sent, Marcus began calmly. I also spent the last 2 days speaking with tenants affected by our policies. The regional director cleared his throat. We understand your concerns, but the pricing model has significantly strengthened shareholder value. Marcus slowly turned toward him. Has it strengthened trust? No one answered. One attorney adjusted his glasses before speaking. Our procedures comply with state regulations. Every notice was delivered according to legal requirements. Marcus nodded once. I did not ask whether it was legal. I asked whether it was right. The room grew noticeably quieter. One board member joining by video leaned forward. Marcus, emotional reactions cannot become company policy. Investors expect consistency. Marcus looked directly into the camera. Families expect consistency too. They expect that working hard, paying rent, and asking for help before falling behind will matter to someone. Another executive spoke carefully. If we suspend the automated rent adjustment system, projected annual revenue could decrease by hundreds of millions of dollars over the next several years. Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he removed the brass key from his pocket and placed it gently in the center of the conference table. The simple sound of metal touching polished wood echoed through the silent room. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. Do you know what this is? Marcus asked quietly. Nobody answered. This belonged to a woman who believed she was unlocking her home every evening. Yesterday she handed it to me because it no longer opened anything. His voice never became louder, yet every word seemed to settle heavily across the room. Every chart inside these folders tells me what we earned. This key reminds me what we cost. The company's chief legal officer sighed softly. Marcus, reversing these policies creates substantial financial exposure. Marcus looked at him with steady calm. Then we will face it. The board may view this as a breach of your fiduciary responsibility. My responsibility is larger than quarterly earnings. The chairman of the executive committee appeared on the video screen, his expression measured and professional. If you proceed without board approval, there will be consequences. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. I know. The chairman folded his hands together. You could lose your position as chief executive officer. A long silence followed. Outside the windows, the last light of day settled across the Cleveland skyline, while office lights gradually illuminated neighboring buildings one floor at a time. Marcus glanced once more at the brass key lying alone on the conference table. He remembered the frightened 11-year-old boy he had once been, watching his own mother pack their belongings into garbage bags while promising that everything would somehow be all right. He had built an empire believing success would prevent that memory from ever returning. Instead, success had nearly caused someone else to relive it. He looked back toward the board members. "If keeping my position requires ignoring what I now know," he said quietly, "then I have been sitting in the wrong chair for a very long time." No one spoke after that. The silence itself became an answer. Marcus gathered the key, slipped it carefully back into his pocket, and walked out of the conference room knowing that before he could restore anyone else's sense of home, he might first have to surrender the title that had defined his own life for years. By the following Monday morning, the story had quietly spread far beyond one neighborhood in Cleveland. It was no longer only about rising rent or one family's eviction. Local churches, school volunteers, senior advocacy groups, and longtime residents had begun gathering inside the recreation hall attached to the community center, hoping someone would finally listen before more families found themselves carrying their lives onto the sidewalk. Folding chairs filled the room beneath bright fluorescent lights, and the steady murmur of worried conversations blended with the soft clatter of coffee cups and children's laughter echoing from a nearby playroom. Naomi arrived early with Eli, carrying nothing more than her canvas bag and the quiet determination that had carried her through every difficult morning. She greeted familiar faces with gentle smiles, helping an elderly neighbor unfold metal chairs before making sure Eli had a coloring book and a box of crayons at one of the small children's tables. She did not come to make a speech. She came because people kept asking what they should do next, and she believed showing up was the first answer. 20 minutes later, Marcus entered through the back doors wearing the same simple navy jacket. This time he did not stay hidden. Several regional managers accompanied him, along with members of the company's housing operations team. Whispered conversations spread across the room as people recognized faces from previous meetings with property management. Marcus noticed Naomi across the hall before she noticed him. She was helping Mrs. Evelyn Brooks find a comfortable seat near the front, moving carefully so the older woman would not strain her knees. Nothing about her suggested someone searching for attention. She simply continued taking care of whoever stood beside her. The community moderator welcomed everyone before inviting residents to share their experiences. One after another, tenants described confusing rent increases, unanswered hardship requests, and the fear of losing homes they had worked years to keep. Marcus listened without interrupting. He filled several notebook pages by hand instead of asking an assistant to summarize anything. Every story carried details that no spreadsheet had ever captured. Then the moderator turned toward Naomi. "Would you like to say something?" The room became unexpectedly quiet. Naomi stood slowly, smoothing the sleeves of her sweater before looking around the hall. She did not rush to speak. Her eyes rested briefly on families holding children close, on older residents sitting shoulder to shoulder, and finally on Marcus, who remained seated near the back without introducing himself. "I do not think I am here because my story matters more than anyone else's," she began softly. "The cameras happened to find me. They could just as easily have found someone sitting beside me today." Several people nodded. Naomi continued with the same calm honesty that had carried her through every difficult conversation. "I know what it feels like when someone decides your future without ever learning your name. I also know that fixing only my situation would not change what happened. If one family gets their home back, while everyone else keeps wondering whether they are next, then we have not solved anything." She paused as Eli looked up from his coloring book and smiled at her. The simple sight steadied her voice even more. "I am grateful for every person who wants to help me. Truly. But I would rather see a fair system than special treatment. My son deserves that. So do your children. So do our parents and grandparents." The room answered with quiet applause that gradually grew stronger, not because her words were dramatic, but because they sounded true. Marcus remained seated, his notebook still open in front of him. He realized she had just declined the very thing many people would have accepted without hesitation. She was not asking to be rescued. She was asking for fairness that did not depend on luck, attention, or television cameras. When the meeting ended, residents gathered in small groups, discussing practical ideas for tenant support and communication. Marcus waited until the room had nearly emptied before approaching Naomi. He held the old brass key carefully in his hand. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Naomi accepted it with a grateful nod, but did not ask how he had kept it safe. She slipped it back into her coat pocket, exactly where it had been before. Marcus looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. You changed something in that room today. Naomi smiled gently. I hope it was not just the room. Marcus watched her walk toward the exit where Eli reached for her hand without saying a word. For the first time in many years, he followed someone else's lead not because she held authority, but because she had reminded him what leadership actually looked like. The board meeting began just after 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning inside the Chicago headquarters of Ellington Property Group. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city shimmered beneath a clear autumn sky, while sunlight reflected across the glass towers surrounding the building. Inside the executive boardroom, however, the atmosphere remained still and heavy. Thick financial reports rested neatly beside every chair. Attorneys organized legal documents. Investors joined through large video screens from New York, Dallas, and San Francisco. No one spoke casually. They all understood that the decision waiting inside the room would shape far more than next quarter's earnings. Marcus Ellington entered carrying only one leather folder. The old brass key remained inside his jacket pocket. He took his seat without opening a single financial report. The chairman began formally. Marcus, the executive committee has reviewed your proposal. Suspending the automated pricing system, restoring previous lease agreements where appropriate, creating independent hardship review panels, and compensating qualified tenants will significantly reduce projected profits. Marcus nodded quietly. I know. Another board member leaned forward. There are less expensive ways to improve public perception. Marcus folded his hands together. I am not interested in improving perception. I am interested in correcting what we allowed to happen. The room settled into another long silence. Charts appeared across the large presentation screen showing projected financial losses if the reforms were approved. Numbers stretched into the hundreds of millions over several years. Share values dipped sharply across every scenario. One investor spoke plainly. If this motion passes, shareholders will expect accountability. Marcus looked toward the screen before calmly answering. They should. He rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the front of the room. Instead of opening another presentation, he placed the old brass key on the polished conference table exactly as he had done days earlier in Cleveland. Several directors exchanged familiar glances. Marcus looked at each of them before speaking. Every decision we make eventually becomes part of someone's ordinary day. Sometimes it becomes breakfast on a kitchen table. Sometimes it becomes a child walking into school believing everything is all right. Sometimes it becomes this. He rested one hand beside the key. This company was built to provide homes. Somewhere along the way, we became better at measuring properties than protecting people. No one interrupted him. He continued with the same steady voice. I signed the policy that allowed these systems to replace judgment with automation. That responsibility belongs to me. If there must be consequences for changing course now, they should begin with me. He reached into his folder and removed a single sheet of paper. If the board believes these reforms are incompatible with my leadership, this is my resignation. The room became completely still. The chairman accepted the envelope but did not immediately open it. Several directors quietly lowered their eyes. They had expected arguments. They had expected negotiation. They had not expected Marcus to place his own position on the table before asking anyone else to sacrifice profits. After several minutes of discussion behind closed procedures, the chairman finally stood. The board has reached a decision. Every face turned toward him. The proposed tenant protection reforms are approved. A quiet breath moved through the room. The board also declines your resignation. Marcus remained silent. The chairman continued. Leadership is measured by the willingness to accept responsibility before assigning it elsewhere. Today you demonstrated exactly that. 3 days later, residents gathered once again inside the recreation hall in Cleveland. This time, representatives from Ellington Property Group announced the creation of permanent hardship review teams, restored lease agreements for families whose cases qualified for reconsideration, reimbursement for documented overcharges, and direct community offices where tenants could speak with real people instead of automated systems. Naomi stood quietly among the crowd, holding Eli's hand as neighbors embraced one another with relieved smiles. When several reporters approached her afterward asking whether she was happy to receive special assistance, she gently shook her head. Nothing special happened for me, she answered. Something fair happened for all of us. Across the room, Marcus watched without stepping forward to claim recognition. He understood now that lasting change was never built around one person's gratitude. It was built around restoring dignity so completely that no one needed to feel rescued. As families slowly left the building beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, Eli looked up at his mother and asked the question she had waited so long to hear. "Mom, are we going home now?" Naomi smiled, squeezed his small hand, and answered with quiet certainty. "Yes, sweetheart. This time we all are." The first Saturday of November arrived with crisp air, bright blue skies, and the kind of golden sunlight that made even ordinary apartment buildings seem warmer than they had only a few weeks before. Maple leaves drifted lazily across the courtyard outside Building 7, while children chased one another between benches where neighbors gathered with steaming cups of coffee. The brick walls had not changed. The sidewalks still carried small cracks from many winters. The old oak tree near the entrance continued dropping acorns across the grass exactly as it always had. Yet the place somehow felt different. Not because the buildings had become newer, but because hope had quietly returned before fresh paint ever could. Naomi Carter stood outside apartment 3B holding the familiar brass key between her fingers. For a long moment, she simply looked at the door. The fresh lock reflected the morning light, clean and untouched, waiting without hurry. Eli bounced gently beside her, his small backpack hanging from one shoulder even though there was no school that day. "Can I do it this time?" he asked with barely contained excitement. Naomi smiled and placed the key carefully into his hand. "You have earned that honor." Eli stepped forward with complete concentration, stretching onto the tips of his sneakers until he could reach the lock comfortably. The brass key slid smoothly into place. He turned it slowly. A soft click echoed through the quiet hallway. The sound lasted only a moment, but it carried weeks of uncertainty away with it. Eli pushed the door open and sunlight poured through the front windows, filling the empty apartment with warm light and long golden shadows across the hardwood floor. The rooms were simple, just as they had always been. The familiar kitchen waited beyond the hallway. The living room still faced the old oak tree outside. Freshly cleaned windows allowed the November sunshine to reach every corner. Nothing inside looked extraordinary, yet everything felt precious because none of it was being taken for granted anymore. Eli laughed and ran carefully from room to room, stopping in front of the wall where faint pencil marks still showed the places Naomi had measured his height each birthday. "Mom," he called happily. They did not paint over it. Naomi walked beside him and gently touched the little lines with her fingertips. Beside each mark remained a handwritten date and a careful measurement she had once feared was gone forever. She closed her eyes for a brief second, breathing in the quiet scent of fresh wood polish and clean air drifting through the open windows. Some memories survived because someone chose not to erase them. Volunteers from the neighborhood soon arrived carrying donated bookshelves, kitchen supplies, blankets, and potted plants. Mrs. Harper baked a peach cobbler that filled the apartment with the sweet smell of cinnamon and brown sugar. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks brought the blue ribbon that had once tied together her treasured recipe cards and insisted Naomi use it to hang a small welcome wreath beside the front door. Laughter replaced the silence that had once settled over the hallway. Children carried boxes far too light to matter while proudly believing they were helping build a home. Shortly after noon, a familiar dark sedan quietly stopped across the street. Marcus stepped out alone, dressed as simply as he had been every time Naomi had seen him. He remained on the sidewalk rather than approaching the apartment. From where he stood, he watched Eli race to the window and wave enthusiastically. Marcus smiled and returned the wave. Naomi noticed him a moment later. She walked outside until they stood a respectful distance apart beneath the old oak tree. Neither hurried to speak. The breeze carried dry leaves across the sidewalk between them. "You never told me who you really were," Naomi said gently. Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "I thought if I introduced myself with a title first, you might never tell me the truth." Naomi considered his words before nodding once. "And now?" Marcus smiled quietly. "Now I hope I spend more time listening than introducing myself." Naomi reached into her coat pocket and removed the brass key one final time. She looked at it, then back toward the apartment where Eli's laughter floated through the open doorway. Instead of handing it back to Marcus, She walked inside, picked up a small wooden hook that one of the volunteers had installed beside the entrance, and carefully hung the old key there. It would never unlock another door again. It no longer needed to. It had become a reminder that a home was not protected by metal alone, but by people willing to see one another before numbers, by leaders willing to accept responsibility before praise, and by ordinary kindness offered without expecting anything in return. Marcus quietly turned and walked back toward his car without waiting for thanks. Naomi watched him leave with peaceful gratitude rather than obligation. Behind her, Eli laughed as sunlight filled every room of the apartment once more. The brass key rested against the wooden hook, catching the afternoon light with a soft golden glow, no longer holding the weight of what had been lost, but reflecting everything that had finally been found. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If Naomi and Eli's journey touched your heart, please share this story with someone who still believes that kindness, fairness, and accountability can change lives. Leave a comment below and tell me which moment stayed with you the most. The old brass key falling onto the pavement, Naomi asking why her door had been locked, or Marcus risking everything to correct the harm caused by his company. If you enjoy meaningful stories about hope, family, redemption, and second chances, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you will not miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourself, continue choosing compassion, and may God bless you.